May 15, 1985, Cannes Film Festival. Tank Morrison had killed 17 men in his military career. Tonight, in the backstage shadows of the Palais des Festivals, he planned to make it 18. The target, Chuck Norris. The method, bare hands. The reason, 20 years of nightmares and a team of dead Marines who deserve justice. Tank's massive frame filled the narrow corridor as Norris approached, flanked by two smaller bodyguards. 300 pounds of muscle and rage, Tank stepped forward. "Carlos Ray," he whispered. Norris stopped dead. His face went white. Those two words, a name that didn't exist anymore, a name buried in classified files, changed everything. What happened next lasted 90 seconds. Security cameras captured none of it. But 3 witnesses would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget what they saw when a dead man's past collided with Hollywood's biggest secret. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence stretched between them like a tripwire. Chuck Norris, no, Carlos Ray, stood frozen in the fluorescent-lit corridor, his trademark confidence cracking like old paint. His bodyguards sensed the shift immediately, hands moving toward concealed weapons, but Ray raised a palm to stop them. "Jesus Christ, Tank." Ray's voice carried the same command authority that had once sent Marines charging into Beirut's hellscape. "You're supposed to be dead. Funny thing about that." Tank's words came out like gravel grinding under tank treads. "So are you." The two smaller bodyguards, expensive suits, probably ex-Secret Service, flanked their client with practiced precision. The blonde one whispered into his sleeve mic. Tank caught fragments, situation developing, need immediate extraction. Tank didn't move. 20 years of Hollywood protection work had taught him patience, but 20 years before that the Corps had taught him violence. Right now, both skill sets were at war in his chest. "Stand down, Morrison." Ray's voice carried that old officer snap muscle memory from when Tank would have died at this man's word. "Whatever you think you know, I know 12 good men are feeding worms because you sold them out." Tank's massive fists clenched. "I know you left us to die in that basement while you played footsie with Syrian intelligence." Ray's face went ashen. Behind him, festival guests wandered the main corridor, champagne glasses clinking, oblivious to the 20-year-old war playing out in their shadow. Somewhere, photographers were capturing smiles and handshakes. Here, old ghosts were settling accounts. "The mission was compromised from day one," Ray said quietly. I think you wanted that Swiss bank account more than you wanted to bring us home." The accusation hit like a .45 slug. Ray actually stepped backward, his bodyguards tensing. Tank had spent 2 decades imagining this moment, rehearsing these words, but seeing the pain flicker across Ray's face felt different than he'd expected. Smaller, emptier. "You don't understand what was at stake," Ray whispered. The list was bullshit. A fairy tale to justify leaving Marines behind. Your brother's name was on that list." The words hit Tank like a sledgehammer to the solar plexus. The corridor tilted. 20 years of certainty crumbled in 3 seconds. "My brother died in Da Nang, 1969. Your brother faked his death in Da Nang. Syrian intelligence had proof, photos, bank records, the whole package." Ray's voice softened, carrying that old paternal tone he'd used before impossible missions. Tommy was selling weapons to the Viet Cong for 3 years. If that information surfaced, "You're lying." But Tank's voice cracked like a teenager's. Tommy Morrison, Silver Star recipient. Tommy Morrison, who'd sent letters home about honor and duty. Tommy Morrison, who'd supposedly died charging a machine gun nest. The Syrians were going to expose him, along with 47 other double agents, some of them still active, some of them with families. Ray stepped closer, and Tank realized he wasn't seeing Chuck Norris anymore. He was seeing Lieutenant Colonel Carlos Ray, the man who'd taught him that sometimes saving lives meant sacrificing everything else. "I made a choice. You made a choice to let 12 Marines die. I made a choice to save thousands more." Tank's world was spinning. The festival noise felt distant, muffled, like he was underwater. He'd built 20 years of rage on a foundation that was suddenly shifting beneath his feet. Even if that were true, it is true, and someone brought you here knowing you'd react exactly like this. Ray glanced over his shoulder, paranoid. This isn't coincidence, Tank. Someone orchestrated this meeting. Someone who knows about Beirut, about the list, about your brother. Who? I don't know. But whoever it is, they want us at each other's throats. They want the list exposed. They want those 47 names in the wind. Ray's hand moved to Tank's shoulder, the same gesture he'd used before sending men into combat. Someone's playing us both. Tank stared at the man he'd planned to kill. The certainty that had sustained him through 20 years of nightmares was evaporating like morning mist. If Ray was telling the truth about Tommy, but if he was lying. The blonde bodyguard was getting agitated, whispering urgently into his mic. Festival security would arrive soon. This conversation would end, and Tank would be left with more questions than answers. Prove it, Tank said. Meet me tonight, midnight. The lighthouse at Pont de la Croisette. Ray's eyes held something Tank hadn't seen in 20 years. Fear. Come alone. And Tank? Watch your back. If someone wanted us to meet this badly, they're not done with either of us. Before Tank could respond, Ray and his bodyguards melted into the crowd, leaving him alone in the corridor with the weight of 20 years of certainty crashing down around him. 3 witnesses had indeed seen everything. None of them would ever forget what they'd witnessed. But none of them understood what they'd really seen. 2 dead men learning they were both still very much alive and very much in danger. Tank Morrison stood motionless in the empty corridor for 17 minutes. The festival crowd had long since moved on to cocktail receptions and private screenings, their laughter echoing from distant ballrooms like ghosts of normalcy. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made his scarred hands look like topographical maps of violence. Somewhere in the building, Chuck Norris, Carlos Ray, was probably fielding questions from reporters about his latest film. Somewhere else, photographers were capturing moments that would grace magazine covers worldwide. Tank wasn't part of that world. He never had been. His reflection stared back from a darkened window, 350 pounds of muscle and scar tissue wrapped in an expensive suit that fooled no one. He looked like what he was, a weapon trying to pass for a man. The thought hit him with surprising clarity, the same way enemy muzzle flashes had once cut through Beirut's perpetual smoke. The walk to his hotel room felt like swimming through molasses. Each step carried the weight of 20 years collapsing. Tank had built his entire post-Marine existence on one fundamental truth. Lieutenant Colonel Carlos Ray had betrayed Echo Company and gotten 12 good men killed for money. That truth had sustained him through PTSD nightmares, through failed relationships, through the slow grind of Hollywood protection work. It had given his survival meaning. Now that foundation was shifting like sand. His room at the Grand Hotel was Spartanly neat, a habit that died hard from military service. No personal photos, no mementos, just the tools of his trade, surveillance equipment, encrypted phones, and a Colt. .45 that had saved his life in 6 countries. Tank sat heavily on the bed's edge and dialed a number he'd memorized 15 years ago but never called. Morrison Landscaping, Maggie speaking. The voice carried Kansas sunshine and infinite patience. It's Vincent. Jesus, Tank. Where are you? You sound like hell. Margaret Morrison, Maggie to everyone, including the brother-in-law she'd never met, was Tank's anchor to something resembling normal life. She'd married his baby brother Danny in 1978, back when Tank was still learning to walk without crutches after Beirut. Danny, who'd been born when Tank was already in high school, who'd grown up hearing war stories that made him choose community college over combat. I'm in France. Working. Tank's voice cracked slightly. How's Danny? Same as yesterday when you called. Same as last week. He's good, Tank. The business is good. Emily made honor roll again. A pause. You okay? You never call twice in 1 week. Emily. His 15-year-old niece who sent him Christmas cards addressed to Uncle Tank, the movie star protector. Danny's daughter, who represented everything good that could grow from Morrison soil. Tank closed his eyes and saw her gap-toothed smile from last year's photo. Tell me about her science project again. Maggie's laugh was warm honey. Solar panel optimization for residential use. I swear she gets it from you. All that technical military stuff. Danny just nods and pretends he understands half the words. Tank smiled despite himself. Emily Morrison, age 15, who wanted to save the world with renewable energy. Who had Tank's mechanical aptitude but Danny's optimism. Who had no idea her uncle spent his nights dreaming about dead Marines and waking up in cold sweats. She still want to visit Hollywood? Every damn day. Keeps talking about touring movie studios and meeting your famous clients. Maggie's voice softened. Tank, what's really going on? You sound lost, broken. Like everything I thought I knew about the last 20 years just turned to smoke. Just a complicated job. Might run late. You be careful, Vincent Morrison. I know you think you're indestructible, but Emily needs her uncle, and Danny needs his brother. We all need you coming home. The line went quiet except for the distant sound of Kansas wind through phone lines. Home. Tank tried to remember what that word meant. His apartment in West Hollywood was just a place to store weapons and count money. The Morrison family farm in Topeka, that was home. Sunday dinners where Maggie pretended his presence didn't make everyone nervous. Danny's proud introductions to neighbors, this is my brother Vincent, he protects movie stars. Emily's endless questions about Hollywood that carefully avoided asking what Tank had done before celebrity protection. They were his vulnerability, his soft spot in a life armored with violence and cynicism. If Ray was telling the truth about the list, about 47 compromised agents, about Tommy, if someone was orchestrating this confrontation, they'd eventually trace Tank's connections. Standard operating procedure. Find what the target loves, then apply pressure. I love you too, Maggie. Kiss Danny and Em for me. Tank hung up and walked to the window. Cans spread below him like a glittering circuit board, all wealth and ambition and carefully orchestrated illusion. Somewhere out there, Carlos Ray was preparing for midnight. Somewhere else, unknown players were moving pieces on a board Tank was only beginning to understand. His reflection stared back from the darkened glass. A man caught between the ghosts of Beirut and the promise of a lighthouse meeting that might finally put them to rest. The hardest truth was the simplest one. After tonight, nothing would ever be the same. Tank turned away from the window, but the phone's shrill ring froze him mid-step. Not his encrypted work line, the hotel phone. His blood chilled. Only 3 people knew where he was staying, his handler, Eastwood's assistant, and hotel management, Morrison. Static crackled across the international connection, then a voice that yanked him back 20 years like a fishhook to the gut. Tank? Jesus Christ, is that really you? The room tilted. Tank gripped the phone so hard the plastic creaked. Tommy? Yeah, brother. It's me. Tommy Morrison. Silver Star recipient. Dead hero of Da Nang. The brother Tank had mourned for 16 years before Beirut, whose memory had been Tank's moral compass through every dark mission afterward. The voice was older now, roughened by decades and cigarettes, but unmistakably the same one that had taught Tank to throw a curveball and hot-wire cars behind their father's barn. You're dead. Tank's words came out strangled. I went to your funeral. I folded the flag for Mom. I know. I'm sorry, Tank. Jesus, I'm so fucking sorry. Tank's legs gave out. He collapsed into the desk chair, his massive frame making it groan. The hotel room's expensive wallpaper seemed to pulse like a living thing. Everything Ray had said in that corridor, every impossible word, was true. Where are you? Bangkok. Been here 15 years. Construction work, mostly. Tommy's laugh held no humor. Turns out being dead is great for job security, but hell on family reunions. Why now? Why call now? Tank's mind was racing through the implications. If Tommy was alive, if he'd faked his death in Da Nang, then Ray's story about Syrian intelligence, about the list, about the choice made in Beirut. Because someone's hunting the list, Tank. All 47 names. 3 guys from my old unit turned up dead in the last month. Professional hits, made to look like accidents. Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper. Car bomb in Saigon, drowning in Manila. Heart attack in Seoul, except the coroner found succinylcholine in his bloodstream. Tank knew succinylcholine. Paralytic agent, untraceable after 6 hours. The kind of exotic poison that suggested serious players with serious resources. Someone leaked that we're still alive, Tommy continued. Someone with access to classified files older than dirt. And Tank? They know about you too. About your work with Ray. About tonight. How do you know about tonight? Because whoever's doing this wants an audience. They want witnesses when you kill Ray. They want the story to come out, the betrayal, the cover-up, everything. It'll destroy the intelligence network that's been protecting us for 20 years. Tank stood and began pacing, his trained mind cataloging threats. If Tommy was right, the confrontation with Ray hadn't been coincidence. Someone had orchestrated their meeting, knowing Tank would react with violence, knowing the truth about Tommy would eventually surface in the aftermath. The list was real? Real as cancer, brother. 47 American servicemen who sold weapons, intel, positions, whatever bought them another day alive in that goddamn jungle. Tommy's voice cracked. I was 19, Tank, scared out of my fucking mind. The Viet Cong had my whole unit surrounded. They offered a deal, information for safe passage. I thought I was saving my men. How many died because of what you sold? Silence stretched across 10,000 miles of fiber optic cable. When Tommy finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I stopped counting at 50. Tank closed his eyes and saw faces. Marines he'd served with who'd never made it home from Southeast Asia. Good men who'd died because someone, his own brother, had traded their lives for temporary safety. The betrayal cut deeper than Beirut, deeper than 20 years of hunting Ray, deeper than anything he'd thought possible. Tommy, don't. I know what I did. I've lived with it every day for 26 years. But Tank, listen. Ray didn't betray Echo Company. He saved us. All of us. The Syrians were going to publish the entire list unless the U.S. pulled out of Lebanon. Ray chose to fake his death, to sacrifice his identity and career, to keep 47 names buried. 12 Marines died in that basement. 12 Marines died because someone else leaked the mission parameters. Ray was trying to save them when the building came down. Tommy's breathing was labored, desperate. He's been protecting us ever since. New identities, false deaths, witness protection, whatever it took. He gave up everything, Tank, his career, his family, his life, to protect pieces of shit like me. Tank stared at his reflection in the darkened window. The man looking back had spent 20 years hating the wrong person, 20 years building rage on a foundation of lies, the emotional equilibrium that had sustained him since Beirut, the clear division between betrayer and betrayed, guilty and innocent, crumbled like a controlled demolition. Someone had orchestrated this revelation. Someone who knew the truth would destroy Tank more completely than any bullet. The phone was still in his hand, but Tank could no longer hear his brother's voice over the sound of his entire world collapsing. The phone slipped from Tank's numb fingers, clattering onto the hotel room's marble floor. Tommy's voice continued speaking from the fallen receiver, tinny and distant, but Tank could no longer process words. The room spun like a centrifuge, 20 years of carefully constructed reality fragmenting into razor-sharp pieces that cut deep as they fell. He stumbled to the bathroom and gripped the sink's cold marble edges, staring at the stranger in the mirror. The same scarred face, the same broken nose from Belfast, the same gray eyes that had watched 12 Marines die in a Beirut basement. But everything behind those eyes, every assumption, every truth he'd built his existence around, was smoke. Tommy was alive. Ray was innocent. Everything Tank had believed about that night in Lebanon was wrong. The nausea hit like a sledgehammer. Tank doubled over the sink, dry heaving until his ribs ached. When the spasm subsided, he splashed cold water on his face and forced himself to think like the operator he'd once been. Strip away emotion. Focus on facts. Fact, someone had engineered his confrontation with Ray. Fact, someone knew about the list, about Tommy, about the cover-up. Fact, someone wanted Tank to kill Ray tonight. But why? What did they gain from exposing a 20-year-old conspiracy? Tank retrieved the phone. Tommy was still talking, his voice increasingly frantic. Have to listen to me, Tank. Don't go to that lighthouse. This whole thing is... I'm here. Tank's voice sounded like gravel in a cement mixer. Who's hunting the list? I don't know. The hit started 3 months ago. Always professionals, always clean. Marcus Chen in Saigon looked like engine trouble. His car just happened to explode in traffic. William Hayes in Manila was supposedly drunk when he drowned. Bullshit. Billy never touched alcohol after 73. Tank's operator instincts kicked in, overlaying tactical assessment onto emotional devastation, pattern analysis. What connects the victims besides Vietnam? All infantry. All sold weapons or position data to the Viet Cong between 68 and 71. All supposedly died in combat but actually went into deep cover after the war. Family status? Dead or estranged. No close connections. Nothing to make their real deaths newsworthy. Tommy paused. Tank, you're different. You're visible. You protect celebrities. If you kill Ray at that lighthouse, with festival witnesses around, it becomes international news. The pieces clicked together with crystalline clarity. Tank wasn't just being manipulated. He was being positioned as the delivery mechanism for maximum exposure. Kill Ray publicly, trigger an investigation, expose the entire network. Someone wants the list burned, Tank said slowly. 47 names released simultaneously. Mass exposure. But why? We're all old men now. Half of us are probably dead from natural causes anyway. Tank walked to his equipment case and pulled out his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard as he accessed classified databases his security clearance still allowed. Maybe it's not about you anymore. Maybe it's about who you've become. New identities, new families, new connections. The searches yielded fragments. Marcus Chen had become a successful import-export businessman in Vietnam, with contracts throughout Southeast Asia. William Hayes had built a shipping empire in the Philippines. Both men had acquired wealth, influence, access to information networks. Jesus, Tank breathed. You weren't just given new identities. You were positioned, embedded in strategic locations across Asia. What are you talking about? The intelligence value. 47 American assets presumed dead, operating with perfect cover in sensitive regions for 20 years. Banking, shipping, construction, communications. Tank's mind raced through the implications. Someone's harvesting the network, killing the assets and stealing their intelligence value. But who would even know? The line went dead. Tank stared at the phone, ice water replacing blood in his veins. Tommy's sudden silence meant one of two things: technical failure or immediate threat. Given the context, Tank assumed the worst. He grabbed his Colt .45 and moved to the window, scanning the street below for surveillance teams. Nothing obvious, but that meant nothing. Professional hunters didn't advertise their presence. The clock read 10:47 p.m. 73 minutes until the lighthouse meeting. Tank's training screamed at him to run, disappear into the European underground, ghost across borders until he could figure out who was pulling the strings. But running meant abandoning Ray to whatever trap awaited at the lighthouse. Running meant never learning who had orchestrated this elaborate manipulation. And running meant leaving Danny, Maggie, and Emily exposed if the hunters decided Tank's family represented unfinished business. He thought about Emily's science project, about solar panels and renewable energy, and a 15-year-old girl who believed technology could save the world. She represented everything good that could grow from the Morrison bloodline's poisoned soil. If someone was cleaning house, eliminating loose ends, she could become a target simply for sharing Tank's DNA. The secure phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. Your brother sends his regards. Lighthouse. Midnight. Come alone, or Kansas gets very interesting. Tank stared at the message until the words burned into his retinas. Whoever was orchestrating this had just made their first mistake. They'd threatened his family. The hunter had become the hunted. Tank's hands moved with mechanical precision as he armed himself for what might be his final mission. The Colt .45 went into his shoulder holster, a ceramic knife into his boot, flashbang grenades into his jacket pockets. 20 years of Hollywood protection work had made him soft around the edges, but muscle memory never died. Neither did the sick familiarity of preparing to kill. The secure phone rang again. Tank almost ignored it, but the caller ID showed Eastwood's emergency line. Tank, where the hell are you? Clint's voice carried the controlled tension of a man accustomed to crisis management. Festival security just informed me that Chuck Norris received a death threat. Someone called the police claiming his bodyguard was planning an assassination attempt. Tank closed his eyes. Another manipulation, another turn of the screw. When was the call made? 20 minutes ago. Accent sounded American male, professional. They knew details about your background that aren't public record. Eastwood paused. Tank, they knew about Beirut. They knew about the 12 Marines. The puppet masters were closing every exit. Force Tank to the lighthouse meeting by threatening his family, then ensure police response would complicate any escape. If Tank killed Ray, he'd be gunned down by French authorities. If he didn't, whoever held Tommy would eliminate them both. Mr. Eastwood, I need you to make a call to Kansas. Danny Morrison in Topeka. Tell him to take his family camping for the weekend, somewhere remote. Don't use phones, don't tell neighbors. Just disappear. Tank. Sir, I've served you faithfully for 4 years. I've taken bullets meant for you. I'm asking for one favor, and I'm asking as a friend. Tank's voice cracked slightly. Protect my family. Eastwood's silence stretched for 10 seconds. When he spoke again, his tone carried the authority of a man who'd commanded both movie sets and military units. Consider it done. But Tank, whatever you're walking into tonight, remember that some battles aren't meant to be fought alone. The line went dead, leaving Tank staring at his reflection in the hotel room's black window. The man looking back was a ghost haunting his own life. 62 years old, 350 pounds of scar tissue and regret, carrying secrets that had poisoned everything he touched. He thought about the last time he'd seen Danny, Christmas 3 years ago. His baby brother had aged into a gentle giant, soft around the middle from Maggie's cooking, hands permanently stained with honest dirt from the landscaping business. Emily had spent the entire visit peppering Tank with questions about Hollywood, her eyes bright with 15-year-old dreams. Do you ever get scared, Uncle Tank? She'd asked, while they assembled her solar panel prototype in Danny's garage. Like when you're protecting famous people and bad guys might be shooting at you? Tank had laughed, deflecting with war stories sanitized for teenage consumption. But the truth was more complex. Physical danger was simple. Bullets and bombs operated according to knowable rules. It was the emotional landmines that destroyed men like Tank, the guilt that ate through armor plating, the knowledge that every person you loved became a target because of what you'd done, what you'd seen, what you carried. Emily represented innocence in a world where Tank had forgotten such things existed. She believed in solar panels and renewable energy, and a future where technology solved humanity's problems. She had no idea her uncle's past was about to reach across 20 years, to destroy everything the Morrison family had built. Tank checked his watch, 11:15 p.m., 45 minutes. He pulled out his laptop and composed 3 emails. The first was his will, leaving everything to Emily's college fund. The second contained coordinates for a safety deposit box in Los Angeles, where he'd stored evidence of every illegal mission he'd run since leaving the Marines. Insurance, in case someone tried to bury the truth with his body. The third email was addressed to Emily Morrison, scheduled to send automatically if Tank didn't check in within 24 hours. By the time you read this, you'll know more about your uncle than I ever wanted you to learn. The newspapers will call me a killer, and they won't be wrong. But the first want you to know that everything I did, every choice I made after Beirut, was trying to build something clean out of something broken. You represent everything good that can grow from bad soil. Don't let my mistakes define your future. The world needs more people like you and fewer like me. Solar panels, not soldiers. Creation, not destruction. Love you, kiddo. Uncle Tank. Tank closed the laptop and stood. 350 pounds of lethal capability wrapped around a core of emotional devastation. The Morrison family's sins were about to come due, payable in blood and revelation. But Emily would survive. Maggie and Danny would survive. Sometimes that was all a broken man could accomplish, ensuring that innocence outlasted guilt. He checked his weapons one final time and walked toward the door. Somewhere in the canned darkness, Lieutenant Colonel Carlos Ray was preparing for their reunion. Somewhere else, the puppet masters were positioning their final pieces. Tank Morrison, the last honest monster in a world full of elegant predators, stepped into the French night to face 20 years of accumulated truth. The reckoning had begun. The lighthouse stood like a bone-white sentinel against the Mediterranean darkness, its beam cutting through the canned night with mechanical precision. Tank approached through the rocky terrain below the coastal road, his 350-pound frame moving with surprising stealth across the uneven ground. 20 years of Hollywood work hadn't entirely erased the ghost skills that had kept him alive in Belfast and Beirut. The tactical situation was everything his Marine training screamed against: unknown number of hostiles, compromised intelligence, emotional interference clouding judgment. But Tommy's life hung in the balance, and Tank had already lost one brother to his own mistakes. He wouldn't lose another. The lighthouse's base came into view at 11:58 p.m. Tank crouched behind a cluster of Mediterranean pines, scanning for threats through night vision binoculars he'd liberated from a film set 3 years ago. The circular stone structure appeared empty, but movement in the upper lamp room caught his attention. 2 figures, one standing casually near the massive lens array, another bound to a chair. Tommy. Even at this distance, Tank recognized the familiar slope of his brother's shoulders, the way he held his head when trying to appear defiant despite being terrified. Alive, but clearly a prisoner. Tank keyed his throat mic. "Ray, you monitoring this frequency?" "Static then, Tank. Don't come up here. It's not what you think." "Story of my goddamn life." Tank emerged from cover and approached the lighthouse entrance, hands visible but ready to draw. "Where's my brother?" "Safe, for now." The voice came from above, but it wasn't Ray speaking. Tank recognized the accent. Educated American's slight southern drawl, someone he'd heard before but couldn't place. The lighthouse door stood ajar. Tank climbed the narrow spiral staircase, each step echoing off ancient stone walls. His mind cataloged escape routes, weapon positions, angles of attack. But as he ascended, fragments of memory began assembling into a pattern he'd been too blind to see. The voice on the radio. He'd heard it in Beirut 20 years ago. Not Syrian intelligence, not foreign hostiles. American intelligence, chain of command. Tank reached the lamp room as understanding hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. Chuck Norris, Lieutenant Colonel Carlos Ray, stood near the lighthouse's massive lens, hands zip-tied behind his back. Tommy sat bound to a chair 10 feet away, conscious but bloodied. Between them, holding a suppressed Walther P-99, stood a man Tank hadn't seen in 2 decades. Colonel Marcus Webb, Tank's former intelligence liaison, the man who'd briefed Echo Company on their Beirut mission. "Hello," Vincent Webb smiled with the casual confidence of someone who'd spent years planning this moment. 20 years is a long time to nurse a grudge, based on incomplete information. Tank's hand drifted toward his Colt, but Webb's weapon was already trained on Tommy's head. "You orchestrated everything. The festival assignment, the confrontation with Ray, my brother's phone call." "Guilty." Webb looked genuinely pleased with himself. Amazing what you can accomplish with patience and proper resource allocation. Though I must admit, your emotional predictability made this almost embarrassingly simple. Why? The word came out like broken glass. Because 47 compromised assets represent 47 intelligence hemorrhages. Your brother and his fellow traitors cost American lives in Southeast Asia, then disappeared into cushy new identities, courtesy of Colonel Ray's misguided conscience. Webb's tone remained conversational, almost friendly. 20 years of potential security breaches. 20 years of wondering when one of them might decide to sell information again. Ray spoke through split lips. They were kids, Webb. 19-year-old kids who made mistakes in hell. Mistakes that killed American servicemen. Webb's mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine anger beneath the professional veneer. "My brother died in an ambush outside Saigon because someone sold patrol routes to the Viet Cong. Want to guess who was working that sector, Colonel?" Tank saw Tommy flinch, and the final pieces clicked into place. This wasn't about national security or intelligence protocols. This was about revenge. Personal, intimate, 20-year-old revenge wrapped in patriotic rhetoric. "So you've been hunting them down," Tank said, "making it look like accidents." "Most of them, yes. But you presented a unique opportunity." Webb's smile returned, cold and predatory. Vincent Morrison, celebrity bodyguard with a reputation for violence, finally tracking down the commanding officer he blamed for Beirut. Perfect story for international headlines. Your public execution of Colonel Ray would have triggered investigations that exposed the entire network. Except Ray didn't betray anyone. Details. Webb shrugged. The story would have been believable enough, emotionally satisfying. 2 birds, 1 very large stone. Tank felt something shift inside his chest, 20 years of misdirected rage finding its proper target. You made one mistake, Webb. Really? And what's that? Tank's voice dropped to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. You should have killed me first. The lighthouse lamp room fell silent except for the mechanical rotation of the massive lens above them. Webb's confident smile faltered slightly as he registered the change in Tank's demeanor. The way 350 pounds of controlled violence had shifted from defensive to predatory in the space of a heartbeat. Empty threats don't suit you, Vincent. Webb adjusted his grip on the Walther, but Tank noticed the weapon's barrel had drifted 2 inches away from Tommy's temple. First mistake. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and your family's still at risk in Kansas. My family's already safe. Tank's voice carried the flat certainty of a man who'd crossed his emotional Rubicon. Eastwood made that call 2 hours ago. They're camping somewhere your reach can't extend. Webb's mask slipped further. You're bluffing. Danny's got a spot up in the Flint Hills. No cell coverage, no roads. Just prairie grass and limestone caves where 3 people can disappear for weeks. Tank smiled without warmth. Your leverage just evaporated. Ray shifted against his restraints, and Tank caught the subtle movement of fingers working behind his back. The old colonel was still operational, still thinking tactically. Good. This was about to get messy. Besides, Tank continued, taking a half-step closer to Webb, you've made several tactical errors tonight that are about to compound exponentially. Such as? You assumed I came here for revenge against Ray. Wrong objective. You assumed I still blamed him for Beirut. Wrong intelligence. And you assumed that 20 years of Hollywood work had made me soft. Tank's hand moved fractionally toward his shoulder holster. That's the mistake that's going to kill you. Webb's weapon snapped back to Tommy, but Tank was already moving. 20 years of protecting celebrities had taught him to read micro-expressions, to anticipate violence before it erupted. Webb's pupils had dilated slightly, his breathing had shifted to combat rhythm, and his trigger finger had tensioned a millisecond before Tank launched himself sideways. The Walther coughed twice, suppressed rounds sparking off the lighthouse's iron framework as Tank rolled behind the massive lens assembly. Webb spun to track him, but Ray had used the distraction to complete whatever he'd been working on with his restraints. The zip tie snapped, and the colonel drove his shoulder into Webb's midsection with the controlled fury of a man who'd spent 2 decades perfecting martial arts for movie cameras. Webb staggered but didn't go down. Professional training kept his weapon raised as he pivoted toward Ray, but Tank was already flanking from the opposite side. The Colt .45 appeared in Tank's hand with the fluid grace of 20 years muscle memory, its muzzle finding Webb's center mass. Drop it. Webb froze, weapon still trained on Ray, caught in a 3-way standoff with Tommy bound helplessly between them. The lighthouse beam rotated overhead, casting shifting shadows that turned the lamp room into a kaleidoscope of threat vectors and tactical options. You know what the real tragedy is, Webb? Tank kept his aim steady, but his voice carried something deeper than rage, a profound exhaustion with the cycle of violence that had consumed his entire adult life. You're probably right about some of those boys. Maybe they did sell information. Maybe people died because 19-year-old kids made desperate choices in an impossible war. Vincent. Ray started to speak, but Tank cut him off. But that's not what this is about, is it, Marcus? This isn't about justice or national security or protecting American lives. This is about a grieving brother who spent 20 years in intelligence work, learning how to dress personal vengeance in patriotic clothing. Webb's hand trembled slightly. My brother died because of them. Your brother died because of Vietnam, because politicians sent children to fight a war they didn't understand against an enemy they couldn't identify in a country they couldn't map. Tank's voice softened with genuine sympathy. I've been carrying that same poison, Marcus, blaming Ray for Beirut when the real enemy was the system that put us all in impossible positions with inadequate intelligence and political objectives that changed weekly. Touching philosophy from a hired killer. You're right, I am a hired killer. Been one since I was 18. But you know what I learned after Beirut? After 20 years of protecting people instead of hunting them? Tank's grip on the Colt never wavered. Sometimes the only way to stop being a monster is to point your teeth at the right target. The lighthouse beam swept across Webb's face, and Tank saw something crack behind the man's eyes. 20 years of careful planning, of methodical revenge, of righteous fury suddenly confronted with the possibility that he'd become exactly what he'd been hunting. Last chance, Marcus. Drop the weapon. Walk away. Find another way to honor your brother's memory. Webb's smile returned, but it was broken now, desperate. You really think it's that simple? That I can just stop? No, Tank said quietly. I think it's the hardest thing you'll ever do, but I think it's the only thing that keeps you human. The mechanical rotation of the lighthouse lens marked seconds passing like a countdown timer. 3 men shaped by violence, trauma, and loss stood frozen in a moment that would define the remainder of their lives. Webb's decision, when it came, would determine whether the cycle of retribution finally ended or claimed 3 more casualties in its endless hunger. Webb's decision manifested not in words, but in the slow, trembling descent of his weapon hand. The Walther P-99 traced a shaking arc toward the lighthouse floor as 20 years of methodical hatred crumbled against the simple recognition of his own humanity. When the gun clattered against stone, the sound echoed through the lamp room like a prayer finally answered. Jesus Christ, he whispered, staring at his empty hands as if they belonged to someone else. What have I become? Tank lowered the Colt but didn't holster it. Webb's surrender felt genuine, but 20 years of violence had taught him that broken men were often the most dangerous. You became exactly what the system trained you to be. The question is what you choose to do next. Ray moved carefully toward Tommy, producing a tactical knife to cut the restraints. Tank's brother looked older than his 41 years, gray threading through hair that had been black at Christmas, lines carved deep around eyes that had seen too much in the past 72 hours. But he was alive, and sometimes that was enough. Tank, Tommy's voice cracked as the zip ties fell away. I never wanted you to know. About Danny's identity, about what we did in Vietnam. We just wanted to disappear, to build something clean. I know. Tank kept his eyes on Webb, who had slumped against the lighthouse's iron framework like a marionette with severed strings. The question is whether we're all going to walk away from this, or whether Marcus here has more surprises planned. Webb looked up with hollow eyes. There are no more surprises, no backup plans, no contingencies. He gestured weakly toward the equipment bag near the lamp assembly. Just surveillance gear and enough documentation to destroy what's left of my career. 20 years of intelligence gathering on 47 men who wanted nothing more than to forget a war that never should have happened. Ray approached Webb slowly, hands visible, movements careful. Marcus, how many of them are left? 12. The admission came out like a confession. I eliminated 35 over 2 decades, made it look like accidents, natural causes, random violence, professional work, clean scenes, no patterns for investigators to trace. Webb's laugh carried no humor. Until tonight, until I let personal satisfaction override operational discipline. Tank felt something cold settle in his stomach. 35 men. 35 lives erased by methodical revenge dressed as patriotic duty. Their families? Never knew. Why would they? Car accidents and heart attacks don't require explanations to widows and children. Webb's professional mask had completely disintegrated, leaving only the broken core of a man who'd spent 2 decades becoming exactly what he claimed to fight against. Clean kills, Vincent, the kind you'd appreciate. No, Tank said with quiet intensity. The kind I spent 20 years trying to stop being. The lighthouse beam swept across them again, and Tank saw Ray studying Webb with the analytical gaze of someone calculating tactical options. But instead of violence, what emerged was something unexpected, understanding. Your brother, Ray said carefully. What was his name? Michael. 2nd Lieutenant Michael Webb, 101st Airborne. Died 3 months before Saigon fell. Webb's voice cracked. 22 years old, engaged to a girl from Alabama who sent letters every week until the Army notification arrived. Tank watched Ray absorb this information, saw something shift in the colonel's expression. Not absolution, the dead couldn't be returned to life, but recognition of shared loss, They'd all been broken by impossible wars fought for unclear objectives. The difference was how they'd chosen to carry their damage. Michael deserved better than this, Ray said finally. He deserved a brother who honored his memory by building something instead of destroying everything he touched. Webb flinched as if struck. Easy words from someone who never lost family to his own failures. "You're wrong." Ray's voice carried quiet authority. "I lost 47 boys I was responsible for, sent them into hell with inadequate preparation because my superiors demanded impossible results from children who should have been in college, not combat. The difference is, I spent 20 years trying to keep the survivors alive instead of hunting them down." Tank felt the emotional architecture of the moment shifting, 20 years of misdirected rage finding its proper foundation. Webb represented everything Tank could have become, everything he'd almost become if he'd chosen vengeance over protection, destruction over construction. "Here's what happens next," Tank said with the authority of someone who'd finally found his moral center. "Webb documents everything. Names, locations, methods, full confession. The 12 survivors get warned, get protected, get a chance to disappear properly this time. And then?" Webb asked. Tank looked at his brother, at Ray, at the broken intelligence officer who'd spent 2 decades becoming a monster in service of love. "Then we all try to figure out how to live with what we've done, how to build something clean out of something broken." The lighthouse beam continued its eternal rotation, casting light across the Mediterranean darkness, a beacon that had guided lost souls safely home for over a century. Perhaps it could guide 4 more. The confession took 3 hours. Webb spoke in the measured cadences of an intelligence professional, documenting 2 decades of methodical elimination with the same clinical precision he'd once used for operational briefings. Names, dates, methods. 35 men reduced to case files in a dying man's final report. Tank recorded it all on Webb's own surveillance equipment, understanding that some stories demanded witness even when they offered no redemption. By dawn, the lighthouse keeper found 4 men sitting in exhausted silence around equipment that would reshape multiple federal investigations. Webb had surrendered his weapon, his credentials, and 20 years of carefully constructed justifications. What remained was simply Marcus Webb, age 58, who'd spent half his life serving his country and the other half betraying everything it claimed to represent. Ray made the necessary calls. Contacts in intelligence, law enforcement, witness protection. The 12 survivors would receive new identities within 72 hours. Webb would surrender to federal authorities in Marseille, ensuring his confession reached proper channels without political interference. The machine of justice would grind forward with its characteristic inefficiency, but it would grind. Tank found himself walking the lighthouse's exterior gallery as Mediterranean sunrise painted the water gold. 20 years of misdirected rage had evaporated overnight, leaving him feeling simultaneously empty and clean. Tommy joined him after several minutes, moving like a man who'd aged a decade in 3 days. "You think we can go home now?" Tommy asked, studying the horizon where fishing boats emerged from coastal shadows. "I don't know what home means anymore." Tank's voice carried no bitterness, only the exhaustion of a man who'd finally set down a weight he'd carried too long. "Danny's farm? Kansas? Hollywood? None of it feels real after this. Maybe that's the point. Maybe we get to choose what's real now." Tank considered this, watching waves break against rocks that had weathered centuries of storms. Below them, Webb sat motionless in the lamp room, while Ray coordinated logistics with voices from another world, the world of official channels and proper procedures that existed parallel to the shadow realm they'd all inhabited for too long. "I keep thinking about Michael Webb," Tank said finally. 22 years old, engaged to some girl in Alabama who probably married someone else and had children and never knew her first love died so his brother could spend 20 years becoming a killer. Tommy leaned against the lighthouse railing, salt wind stirring hair that needed cutting. "You think Webb can find his way back from what he's done?" "I don't know, but I think he has to try." Tank pulled out his phone and scrolled through missed calls from Eastwood's people. 47 messages about festival obligations, interview schedules, photo opportunities. The machinery of celebrity protection demanded his attention, but it felt like signals from a satellite orbiting a distant planet. I think we all have to try. The ferry from Marseille arrived at noon. Tank watched Webb board with federal agents who'd maintained professional courtesy despite their obvious disgust at his confession. No handcuffs, yet, but the man climbing the gangway bore no resemblance to the confident intelligence officer who'd orchestrated their reunion. Justice would follow its course. Some stories ended with redemption, others simply ended. Ray opted to return to Los Angeles via private aircraft, arrangements already made through contacts who specialized in discretion. Before departing, he handed Tank a card with only a phone number written in careful script. "For when you're ready to stop running," Ray explained. "I train security specialists now. Corporate work, witness protection, extraction operations. Clean work for people who need a chance to build something better." Tank pocketed the card without reading it. "And if I'm never ready?" "Then you're not the man I served with in Beirut." Ray's smile carried 20 years of hard-earned wisdom. That Vincent Morrison died saving 12 men in a collapsing building. What you've become since then is your choice, but it doesn't erase what you were. Tank and Tommy caught the evening ferry to Nice, then a commercial flight to Kansas City that landed just after midnight local time. The rental car smelled like industrial cleaning solution and broken air conditioning, but it carried them through familiar darkness toward something that might eventually resemble home. They found Danny Morrison exactly where Eastwood's people had promised, a limestone cave system 40 miles southeast of Topeka, where 3 generations of Tank's family had sheltered from prairie storms. Danny emerged from shadows carrying a hunting rifle and 20 years of questions he'd never asked his brother. The reunion lasted until sunrise. Stories shared, explanations offered, forgiveness granted and received. As morning light filtered through ancient rock formations, Tank understood that some wounds heal not through dramatic gesture but through simple presence, through choosing to stay instead of run, through building something clean from whatever remained. 3 weeks later, Tank Morrison resigned from celebrity protection and enrolled in a program training security specialists for witness relocation. It was clean work, protective work, work that honored the dead by keeping the living safe. Sometimes, that was enough.